Hi, this week you're going to be doing a collage about um, three of the design elements. You're going to do three separate collages. One of the collages will focus on shape, where you'll communicate the concept of shape. The second collage will focus on value, where you will communicate the concept of value. And the third collage will focus on the concept of texture. So I thought I'd briefly introduce you to these concepts so that it made it easier for you to um, think about it as you do your design project. So starting out with line, line is basically a moving dot. So it's used all the time in design because it's really hard to create shapes without line. So you almost always have line in composition. And line has different characteristics. Some lines are really thin, some lines are really thick, some lines are curved, some lines are gestural, some lines are really stiff and mathematical. So they have their own unique style and personality. And as a designer, you're going to really think about that as you apply line to your designs and illustrations. So this is just an example of how you could lay out a series of lines in different ways to communicate different emotions or feelings. So in the upper left, you see that it's really orderly and conservative and static. And then on the lower right, you kind of see how they're starting to curve. They're not as static. You kind of get the sense of motion. So line can really communicate things in different ways depending on how you lay it out on the page. Line can be used to describe flat shapes. And here you see in this design, line is really unifying because the whole piece is in the exact style that really creates this sense of harmony and unity. And lines often are used to sort of divide space as well as create content within the space. So notice that in between all the little thick areas of marker, there are these white lines that are going through the space. That's sort of a grid that's dividing and separating the content. And that happens all the time in design, where the negative space will actually create a sense of line to divide the space. But line directs the flow of content and is used to create emphasis. This is a Velvet Crush album cover, and the lines are very gestural, they're textured. Notice there's also a sense of depth occurring because the old boom box in the back is very thin, and the lines creating the figure are really thick and dark. And so you see that you can have unlimited variations of line within one design, and those variations can create a sense of depth, or they can convey different moods or feelings. And so that's important to think about as you go forward. You don't have to stick to one style. You can really mix up the type of lines that you put inside of your drawings and illustrations. This is another quick gestural drawing done with a ballpoint pen, and it was done for a fictional book on the psychology of canines. And you can see how there's a sense of emphasis being created here with the really thick dark lines around the dog's mouth and eyes. So that's a strategy that designers use often to create emphasis, is to darken the lines or overlap the lines or thicken the lines. So as you kind of go forward, you really think about how to divide the space, how to create emphasis in the quality of the line that you create. Lines are also really important in web design and in book design layout. You create sometimes these wireframes in web design where you're going to divide the content into different sections. They're also really important for sketching and conceptualizing in logo design. And they're used as alignment tools to properly align text and images in both graphic design and web design. And there's a whole grid system that was created by a famous Swiss graphic designer named Joseph Müller-Brockmann that we'll study a little bit later in the course. So definitely you want to understand lines because they'll help you communicate a certain feeling or idea, and it'll make it easier for you to create a message more effectively in your work. This is a great book design. It's like a little pamphlet or brochure where the lines are really thick and different colors, and they're used to create this sense of motion and space. And I think they actually are photographs of cars going down the road, and it's a time-lapse exposure. So you just get this sense of speed and light as each of the cars kind of goes through on the road. It's really cool. I love the text on the side of the graphics here and how that text creates sort of a textured line pattern going down the figure. And so text itself is sort of a line that you can think about in terms of how can text, if you apply it throughout a design, be used as a unifying element. And in these designs, you notice that there's sort of this hand-drawn calligraphic style on some of the text, and then there's a more sort of refined, precise, smooth style being applied to the larger titles. So kind of two examples here. The top image is very organic, and the bottom image is more sort of mathematical. This is that book by Joseph Mueller Brockman that kind of describes and explains the grid system in design, which is, he was a really influential figure, especially in the movement known as Swiss design. So line, how do you define it? It's a moving dot. This is a really quick gestural design, drawing done with just simple lines. Some of the lines are a little bit thicker, but for the most part, they're pretty uniform. And sometimes lines just sort of move through the space. Line direction can change and shift. It can be horizontal, then go vertical, then go diagonal. Line quality can shift. It can be delicate or it can be bold. This is a great advertising campaign for these drawing pens because it literally shows you what type of lines each pen is going to create at the weight described. So I thought it was really clever. So think about line as you go forward. Line can create texture. There's something called implied line too, where we sort of get a sense of line through the placement of shapes. And how that works is it's not a line that's actually drawn, but it's created by a group of objects seen from a distance. And the implied line is the direction an object is pointing to. So sometimes it can be from a figure's eyes. So if a figure is looking at something, there's sort of an implied line that goes from where the figure is looking to where the figure's eyes are resting. And so that's one example. Also, for example, if you look at a road and there's the little lines that are in the center of the road, those are implied lines. So it's creating this uniform line, even though the lines are broken up into tinier, small lines. And this is just a series of really tiny lines that's creating this real textured effect in this drawing. Example of lines creating perspective. So perspective is a method of showing depth that incorporates position, overlapping objects, and it's where you create these lines that go into the space and they converge at points, and those points are on what's called the horizon line, which is where the viewer's eye theoretically is. And it is creating this sense of depth in the space. And it's a whole study that occurred, throughout art history, where fine artists were really trying to get correct perspective, especially before the invention of photography. And so perspective has been this huge study that's been developed, but line can be done, or line can be used to create correct perspective in drawing. Okay, so we're going to go forward and we're going to look at other elements of design like shape. Shape is the general outline of something, a closed form or path. And design is just really the arrangement of shapes. And there are representational shapes and non-representational shapes. And there's geometric shapes, and these are kind of described in mathematical terms, and they're very regular, precise. And then there's sort of more organic shapes. They're more difficult to describe. They're more often found in nature. And for example, clouds, puddles, leaves, rocks. Shapes are described in Illustrator as paths. So you have closed paths and open paths, and an open path would just be a line, whereas a closed path would actually be a shape. And shapes create the general outline of things, and also there is shape outside of the applied artwork. So for example, if you draw a shape in a frame, the outside of the area where you drew is also a shape. And shapes can be open or they can be closed. They can be a flat color or they can be a stroked shape where there's a line around the shape. There's positive and negative shapes where in art, something's considered positive or negative depending on how it's used. So positive shapes are usually those within the subject matter or within a work of art, and negative shapes are those in the background or around the positive shapes. And this is a kind of a cool illustration showing negative and positive space. Another one. This was a great ad campaign by Avia, and it really reflects the emotion and passion and intensity of sports participation. One thing you'll notice is that the figures are not looking at the camera. They're actually kind of turned purposely away so that we like to identify ourselves as being those figures. If we saw their actual expressions or faces more clearly, it wouldn't allow us to sort of put ourselves inside this frame. But what I love about this campaign is the way the shapes fill the frame and create these beautiful, interesting negative shapes around the edges of the forms. M.C. Escher is one of the world's most famous graphic artists, and he did these impossible constructions where he really explored infinity. And during his lifetime, he made over 448 lithographs and over 2,000 drawings and sketches. And they're just amazing. And they're all sort of exploring depth. They're exploring shape and this idea of infinity through just the impossible mathematical constructions of his illustrations. And then we have color or outline. Color is really powerful and provocative. And often colors are just simple flat shapes. Color is divided into three distinct principles. There's hue, which is the name of the color. There's value, which is the range of light to dark. And then there's saturation, which is the brightness or the dullness of the color. And there's all these different tools that you have to create color as a designer. So you'll have a color wheel that you might use. That's organized into primary colors, secondary colors, intermediate colors, and where the color lies on the wheel can be significant in determining sort of a color family that you might use in your design. And color is basically just a form of light, but it's also a way to describe and create emotion within design. So this is a famous painting by Pablo Picasso. And I think it's called Crouching Figure. And it just looking at it, that blue, sort of morose, dark blue makes us feel the sadness of the figure in the frame. Value is probably the hardest one for new designers, and it refers to the relative lightness or darkness of a certain area. And it can be used for emphasis or used to create a focal point for a design or picture. And it's really, the value is described as pure white to pure black and all the ranges in between. So black is the lowest or darkest value and white is the highest or lightest value. And you kind of go in between, where in this particular illustration design, red, like this sort of middle color red, would be the middle color. And then the text in there that's a little bit lighter would be a higher value or a lighter value. And then the pure white would be the lightest value. So you can kind of use any color to describe value, but it's really that range from pure black to pure white that you're thinking about. And this is really dark values. I love the kind of mood or feeling in this poster, but you notice that the text is really light, and that creates contrast and also creates sort of a visual focal point for us. So this is an example of high contrast And you get a lot of contrast if you have extreme difference between the lightest and darkest values in an image. So high contrast images have a large range of values, whereas low contrast images have a more narrow range of values, resulting in sort of a flatter look. And it's, low contrast images can be really beautiful, but they're a little bit harder because people like contrast. And so a high contrast image is going to kind of instantly make us look, whereas a low contrast image is more subtle and you might not look at it as quickly. Value scales are used frequently, and it shows sort of the changing values or tone. And you can use either, blocks of the value shifts, more of a scale, or you could use a continuous gradient of tones. And we'll be looking at some art movements where they really use value, like Russian constructivism posters have really high contrast. And you can kind of see that in different types of design where value is used in different ways to create the content. And then there's texture. Texture refers to that surface quality of the object, and it appeals to our sense of touch. And this is a great photograph. I just want to reach out and sort of reach my hand in there and touch that texture. And we associate textures with the way things look or feel. Everything has some type of texture, and we describe texture in different ways. It can be rough, it can be smooth, it can be shiny, it can be fuzzy. Some things feel just like they appear, and some things look rough, but they're actually smooth. So, you have to think about that as a designer. And there's a visual or implied texture. So, great sculpture by Merritt Oppenheim. Patterns create texture. So if you repeat a shape over and over and overlap it, it's going to create this sense of texture that can be really useful in design. Text can create texture. This is just a great example of texture by using overlapping text elements. So it's really kind of representing that surface quality, and visual textures are created all the time by designers, and it's that illusion or that tactile quality that you're looking for. So often texture is used to create focus, or it can create contrast, or it can help to visually balance a design. And textures are everywhere. So as a designer, you should collect your textures. Take pictures of wood bark, of patterns that you like, and think about how you could strategically put those into your designs. This is a beautiful illustration for Edgar Allan Poe's Tales of Mystery and Imagination, and just look at all of that ornate texture in there. All those patterns creating that sense of texture. This is a Lou Reed album cover where text is the texture. It's almost carved into that skin. And then there's format. You always have a format that you're thinking about as a graphic designer. So it'll be a size that you're constrained by and that you have to think about. And then, how do you place your elements, whether it be shapes or lines or textures or different value ranges inside of your object, will have a significant effect. For example, if you overlap shapes, you're going to get a sense of depth. Larger objects appear closer, smaller objects appear farther away. There's a sense of atmospheric perspective that you achieve by using value ranges. So for example, as mountains recede into the distance, they begin to lose color, brightness, and detail, and you can kind of mimic that in design. And then there's shading, where you kind of mimic light as it hits an object. And then there's linear perspective, where we're thinking about using lines to converge onto these points to create the sense of depth. So as you look at designs, think about these elements. How did the designer use the elements, and what are the elements? Did the designer use color? Did the designer use shape? Did the designer use texture? Does the text create sort of a texture, or does it create a shape? Where is the negative space? Is the negative space interesting to look at, or does it look like elements are just floating inside the space? So you are going to create 3 collages. One collage is going to be about shape, one collage is going to be about value, and one collage is going to be about texture. So these are some examples of texture collages created by students in the past. I love this one. It's really subtle, but there was newspaper print and then this old image used and a map. So it was very cool. This one is kind of an example of both texture and value. So there's definitely value occurring here, but there's also texture. So this project is about intent. So when you upload your designs, you really need to label them and clarify which design is texture, which design is value, and which design is shape, so that we know your intent. Because often you're using multiple elements to create your collage, but I really want to know which one you intend us to see. And if you were to tell me this collage is representing texture, I would get it. But it also would, be about value too. So here's value again. And here's a beautiful one done with some textures, some shapes, but the student's intent was to communicate value. Another one, value. And this one, I see a lot of shape, but the student's intent was value, which I thought was interesting because of the idea of the skin tone. This was a beautiful one about shape, just using positive and negative shapes. Another one. And you can use, in this shape collage, you can use literal shapes that are in the world. You can use abstracted shapes. You can use non-objective shapes, organic shapes, mathematical shapes, or a combination of all types of shapes. And sometimes it's smart to just keep it simple, keep it black, white, and gray so that we focus on the shape instead of if you add a lot of color in, you can start to get distracted by the color. So for example, this one's nice. It's interesting. I love the shape of the figure, and that little red dot really creates emphasis and focus. But I do get a little distracted by the color. It seems to be about color to me, but it's also about shape. So if you want to keep it simple, keep it kind of neutral in gray, and it makes it sometimes easier. And this was an example that I wanted to show you, which was not successful. So the student's intent was to communicate color and value, but if you look at it, it's just, there's so much negative space that's not being utilized. It feels like this graphic's just floating in the middle. So there's not a real intent here that's successful to create an interesting collage. And this is having the same problem. So there's cool elements here. I like that they're using real objects, but the intent of creating a sort of visually interesting collage is sort of lost. So as you go forward, I want your collage to be sort of captivating and interesting. I want it to have focus and to pull and draw me in. So you don't just want it to communicate the concept. You do want it to communicate the concept, but you also want it to be interesting to look at, compelling, make me think. So let me know if you have questions. You're going to upload all 3 of your collages. Make sure to, describe them in the file name. So the first collage can be shape, the second collage can be texture, and the third collage can be value. And those will be the file names that others see when you upload. So it'll make it obvious which file is intended for which. Or you can write a note in your upload describing which is which, if that's a better strategy for you. And just let me know if you have any questions.